Being punished when you're in servitude to someone is never good, and the farther back in history we go, the worse it seems to be. You might be familiar with this punishment from witch trials, but I promise you it was used on way too many women in servitude as well. You ever hear about a Scold's bridle? Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brank's bridle, or simply branks, this was an instrument of punishment as a form of public humiliation. This device was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head, where a bridle bit or curb plate around 5 cm by 2.5 cm in size was slid into the mouth and pressed down on the top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely, and caused extreme pain and psychological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission and silence. This prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. If you were wearing it, then you'd be led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, somebody could attach a bell to you just to draw in those crowds. In Scotland, ranks could also be permanently displayed in public by attaching them to, the town cross, tron, or toll booth. Then the ritual humiliation would take place with the miscreant on public display. Displaying these in public was intended to remind the populace of the consequences of any rash action, slander. Whether the person was paraded or simply taken to the point of punishment, the process of humiliation and expected repentance was the same. A ducking chair, not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools woman accused of having acts with the devil would have to sit on, was a wild form of punishment back in the day. This stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, where the offender was seated with an iron band placed around them so they're not going to fall out. You'll want to make sure they stay put. Usually the chair was fastened to a long wooden beam, fixed like a seesaw on the edge of a pond or river. Sometimes the stool was not a fixture, but was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels so that it could be wheeled through the streets, and at the river edge was hung by a chain from the end of a beam. In sentencing a woman, the authorities would have ordered the number of duckings she should have, and as much as I've scoured the internet, I can't seem to find number data, so if you know, please let me know in the comments. Another type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and this was the chair on 2 wheels with 2 long shafts fixed to the axles. This would be pushed into the pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes this punishment proved fatal, and somebody would die. The term shrew gained popularity in 16th and 17th century England, even loaning its name to William Shakespeare's play The Taming of the Shrew. A shrew, not unlike a scold, was a boisterous and dominating woman who would not relegate herself to the roles that society assigned to her. So in medieval Germany and Austria, if a shrew dared to fall out of line, she might be met with the shrew's fiddle. Though like a fiddle in shape, any resemblance to the vibrant sounding instrument stopped there. With a large opening for the neck and 2 smaller openings for the wrists, this fiddle locked its wearer's head in place and restrained and immobilized her arms, which were essentially cuffed in front of her face. The Judas Cradle, a macabre invention, involved lowering victims onto a sharp pyramid-shaped seat. It was believed that the damn thing was named after Judas as a mean of punishing those who were deemed to have betrayed their fellow human. Man, woman, whatever. Suspended above the ground, the victim's weight would gradually force the point into the body, causing unbearable pain. Sometimes a weight was added to the victim's legs, which increased the pain, but also resulted in a quicker death. Other times, oil was put on the device, which again increased the pain. Various innovations were used to make torment on the cradle more painful. No, not less painful, more. To begin with, the device was never washed, which made it super duper dangerous and infectious. Because sure, maybe you survived the pain, but then you've got these deadly infections coming your way. Among other methods, the victim was repeatedly pushed down on the pyramid to, you guessed it, increase the pain. Sometimes you might be raised on the ropes, given a momentary moment of chilling, but this wasn't done out of mercy. This was just to make it worse when you went back on. This device symbolized both physical and psychological torment, as the body would eventually succumb to the relentless agony. The breaking wheel was specifically designed to render victims' limbs useless. Also called the Catherine wheel, this device kind of always killed its victim, but it did so very slowly. The victim's limbs would be tied to the spokes of a large wooden wheel, and this wheel was then slowly revolved, while the punisher smashed the victim's limbs with an iron hammer, breaking them in many places. Once the bones were broken, whoever it was left on the wheel to die. Now sometimes the wheel would be placed on a tall pole so birds could pick back and do whatever they needed to the still living human, because it could take up to 2 or 3 days to pass from dehydration. Sometimes it was mercifully ordered that the Punisher strike the criminal on the chest and stomach, blows known as the kudaka, or blow of mercy, which caused lethal injuries, which would make the end come a lot faster. Cutting somebody in half wasn't always just a magic trick. Saws were common punishment devices because they were found pretty easily in most homes, and you didn't need anything crazy. It was a cheap way to punish and kill a victim accused of witchery, adultery, blasphemy, or theft. The victim would be tied upside down, allowing all of that human redness to go right to the brain. This ensured that your victim would maintain consciousness for as long as possible. It also slowed the loss of fluids and caused maximum humiliation. During the 16th and 17th centuries, tormentors at the Tower of London used the Scavenger's daughter as a punishment device. This was a metal frame that compressed the victim's body in on itself. So unless you're a contortionist, aye! Compression from this was so intense that it could apparently cause the victim to start exuding redness from the nose, the mouth, and other parts of the body. Yep, this could often result in death. While the Scavenger's daughter might not have been as widely used as some of the other heinous devices we've talked about today, historical records, including illustrations, writings, and accounts from the time period, provide evidence that it did exist and it was used. A cheap and popular way to end somebody slowly was by forcing a rat through a victim's body as a way to escape a cage they'd been put in. And yes, I'm going to elaborate, the rat was caged, not the human. The poor human would be strapped down to the point where they could not move before having little slits put into their body. And then you'd put the hungry rat in there just to chew away. Gnawing at intestines usually took a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days, depending on how long your victim could hold on. And unless somebody stopped this almost immediately, once again, you're gonna get a death on your hands. Used as a horrible punishment for women, the chest ripper was used to inflict pain, fluid loss, and the obvious damage of specific sacks of flesh. It was usually used on women accused of conducting adultery. The claws were often placed red hot on the victim's exposed bosom, the spikes penetrating to achieve a powerful grasp. Then they were pulled to rip off or shred what they were attached to. And hey, if you didn't die, well then you're going to be scarred for life because your chest is literally torn apart. A common variant was known as the spider, which is a similar instrument attached to a wall. The victim's sacks of flesh were fixed to the claws, and then you'd be pulled by the Punisher away from the wall, which would remove or harm what it was attached to. Once again, this killed a lot of people. And finally for today, the Pair of Anguish was a device that a lot of folks labeled as a medieval torment device, and rightfully so. Supposedly, somebody would insert this into a person's mouth, or their nether regions, or rear end in order to widen the orifice and cause extreme pain. It was a pear-shaped instrument consisting of 4 leaves that slowly separated from each other as the inflictor of pain turned the screw at the top. There are a number of examples of very ornate and elaborate pear-shaped devices with 3 or 4 leaves or lobes driven by turning a key that rotates the central screw thread, which spread the leaves, and you see these in museums devoted to the subject of punishment. And some, but not all, have spikes just hanging out there. Well, that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!